Hello, I'm Emily Hawthorne, a Middle East and North Africa analyst at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview. Subscribe today at stratfor.com.
You're listening to the Essential Geopolitics podcast from RANE, the Risk Assistance Network and Exchange. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for joining. In today's podcast, we are talking about a country that has determinedly maintained neutrality in the face of the Ukraine war. Or has it? The country is India, and I'm lucky enough to speak to Ekta Raghuwanshi, RANE's South Asia analyst today, about India's stance. Welcome, Ekta.
Thank you, Emily.
So can you talk to me a little bit about the rationale for India's neutral stance on the Russian invasion?
Yeah, sure, I would love to. Since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine started, India has been one of the major outliers in not condemning Russia directly. In many UN meetings, in many resolutions, it has chosen to deliberately abstain from condemning Russia. One of the major reasons for this is India's dependence on Russian military supplies for its own defense needs. In the present context, Indian national security interest in the region, it faces very tough choices with China and Pakistan, and almost like a standoffish position with China. India needs Russia's military imports. Russia supplies roughly half of India's total arms imports and about 70% of all of its advanced military equipments, including battle tanks, aircraft carriers, nuclear-powered submarines. The list goes on and on. So this reliance on the Russian arms cannot be at this moment, there are no proper alternatives for India except for the Russian arms. This is the major reason why India has chosen not to condemn Russian actions in Ukraine as of now.
Well, let me ask you really quickly, Ekta. Does not condemning Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, is that the same as remaining neutral?
It is. It is for India because now we are in the conflict where we've seen it's a clear invasion by Russia, but India has continued to just call for dialogue and diplomacy and ceasefire. It has not yet said that it is Russia's fault or it instigated the conflict or anything like that. So it is portraying itself to be neutral in this conflict because it is trying to balance both the West, the US and the Europe, and Russia because of its own strategic needs.
So speaking of those strategic needs, I mean, how is India continuing its oil imports, for one thing, from Russia? How is that affecting its relationship with countries that are holding Russia to account, such as Western countries like the European Union and the United States?
Correct. So the West, US and the Europe are trying really hard to sanction Russia, to dent Russian energy exports and all such things so that it reduces the funding for the war. But India is amongst the few outliers who have not completely stopped their oil purchases. I would like to note here that Indian oil imports from Russia account for only about 1 to 2% of its total oil imports. So it's not a huge quantity in it itself. However, uh, it can be argued that India is using the war or the discounted rates that Russia is offering at this time to procure more and more oil, more than it could have done in the normal year. According to some Bloomberg and Reuters reports, India has already procured more oil from Russia than it did in total 2021 in only 2 or 3 months. So India is using its own position as a neutral actor in this conflict to try to get as much cheaper oil as it can. And because oil is not directly sanctioned by either the US or the Europe or any other banks or things like that, oil is out of the purview of the sanctions as of now. So it's not completely illegal for India to import oil. However, it does affect its perception of using this conflict to its own advantage. And the West has diplomatically tried to uh, ask India or urge India to, stop or reduce the oil imports at this crucial time of course, in history. But India has still not done it, and there are negotiations as we speak from Indian state refineries as well as private refineries to get even more oil for the next 2-3 months. So that's one of the major balancing acts that India is trying to do.
Well, it doesn't seem to really be a balancing act, does it? I mean, 2% of its total oil imports could probably be replaced by other sources, so it's actually making an active choice to import Russian oil, and that goes against the West's preferences, correct?
It does, and that's a major point of debate currently. What India is trying to justify here is that it will always follow an independent foreign policy, and it will look after its own interests. Multiple times, Indian officials have argued that European oil imports are still fivefold or 10 times more than what India is importing now, and they are actively choosing not to point that they are choosing to import oil at this point. However, this is where India's own independent foreign policy comes into play, and it seems like they are portraying it like India won't be coerced by any other actor to decide on what it needs for its own national security or even energy security for oil imports.
So, other than sort of resisting entreaties from countries that wish India to find alternative supplies or stop importing so much right now, what are some of the other implications for India?
Domestically, a major implication or impact would be, as we discussed, India's dependence on Russian arms imports. India is has been already trying to diversify arms imports from countries like US, France, Israel, uh, and it was also trying to uh, further its own indigenous defense production in the country. Everything was already was progressing at a slower pace, but the Russian conflict and the notion that maybe India cannot depend on Russia in the long term for the defense imports has just accelerated the process within the government's policy options, that it needs to diversify its defense imports. It needs to further put more capital, more money in its own defense industry. So that's one thing that I see happening as a result of this larger Russian war in Ukraine. Secondly, India's another very, very important national security threat comes from China, currently from the neighborhood. And to balance the Chinese threat, India's relationship with the West, with US, with the EU, we already saw this shift or we saw this closeness between India and the West in the recent past. We saw the development of Quad and other such mechanisms. The India will actively try to forge even closer ties with the US, with the EU, even strategic ties or even trade ties to deal with the Chinese threat in its own neighborhood. Those are the two things I see happening as a result of this conflict.
All right, well, thank you very much for that analysis, Ekta.
Thank you.
Ekta Raghuwanshi is a South Asia analyst with RANE. You can find her columns on RANE Worldview. Subscribe today and get 4 weeks for just $1. That's a great deal. Sign up at stratfor.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.